Yeah, yeah. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the folks in the room, and welcome to everybody online to the, I think now, 54th series of the Martin Center research seminars. And we're speaking this year on the forms of dialogue, and we're really, really excited to have Juan Oyarbide with us, who's going to be speaking exactly on that topic, using some of the projects that he's worked on over the years in practice. And yeah, it's a real honor to have Juan with us because I was lucky enough to work with Juan many years ago, and then on and off over the years since. And he's an extremely talented architect, trained in architecture at Butler, and has worked for many years at Heatherwick Studio as well as in Japan. And then more recently as a director at Pryor & Partners, and also of his own practice, Boom Studio. Yeah, I believe you're talking today on some of your own projects. So it's really fascinating to have the professional sort of perspective here in our academic context. So if everybody's able to give Juan a warm welcome.
Right. Well, thanks to everyone for inviting me to this talk on dialogues. I'm gonna go straight to basically the brief that I sent in terms of the lecture. I was quite inspired by the way in which you actually been framing this lecture about dialogues, and it's quite a big word, to be honest. Actually, dialogues are a fundamental part of pretty much everything we do as humans. Starting from the dialogue we have with ourselves to actually how that extends to everything else. But in particularly, one of the things, like the title of the talk is Dialogues, that is coming from your request on actually talking about forms of dialogues in architecture and scales in architectures. And the reason behind is mainly because we actually these days see a lot of different disciplines in architecture. But in my understanding of architecture, everything from the handle of a door to a room to a kitchen to one small house, a medium, high-rise, a complex of different buildings, all the way to the city. I really see that as part of architecture. And actually, to some extent, that actually relates to the way in which I've been progressing and learning throughout my career. So I'm from the north of Spain, San Sebastian, where I actually study architecture, and where I have actually the privilege to work locally and understand that context. Right after I come to London with my master's in the Bartlett, and that was actually a way of start actually just making wider my understanding of the design world. Further from that, actually went to Japan, and I was exposed to a completely different design environment and challenges. And it's been basically a journey in which progressively, to some extent, from actually smaller scale things, start actually growing into bigger kind of lands of territories of architecture. And currently, I'm mainly working on master planning and urban design at Pryor & Partners. Dialogues in design is the way in which I like to talk about this lecture today. So start from the point of view that dialogues in design, they require actually a communication. It's very likely that when we start actually a debate, when we start actually a dialogue, we might actually communicate, we might actually not communicate. And that means that there are actually two parts of it. One is basically the misunderstanding. So in a very kind of elemental way, when we talk about dialogues, there is one fundamental part, that is the fact that we're talking about and try to actually exchange information. Ideally, communication should be about exchanging knowledge, and that is something that is actually quite telling about the way in which we actually look about our own dialogues. This diagram here shows about misunderstanding and disagreement, and one is not to understand what the other is saying. The other one is that when you don't really want to really take into account what the other is saying. And that happens a lot in the role that we play in architecture. The more we actually start giving concessions and compromising things, the more we start actually getting together into one agreement. And that agreement is also fundamental, because the most important thing, in my opinion, to think about is that it's extremely collaborative. job. Unless you go alone on your own to the forest and you start cutting timber to build something on your own, in general terms, everything we do is actually a collaborative work. And it's actually something that we really need to actually have dialogues, communicate, exchange knowledge, be able to actually achieve our goals. So on this, just like basically journey from the beginning of the conversation and dialogue all the way to the understanding, there are so many different interconnected parallel dialogues that are happening that it would be probably impossible to number all of them. But I like to actually just mention a few of them that I think will be relevant later on when I show you the examples of the project. The internal dialogue between a team, obviously about design. Different teams within a practice will actually require as well to have their own dialogues to understand what they do as a practice. That is a practice in itself. It's actually an internal dialogue, how they actually operate, and different skills are coming together. Dialogue with the collaborators that are outside of your practice. Stakeholders, the community, the extended community, a fundamental one. Who are we designing for? That dialogue is very important. The authorities that they provide approvals and they actually are part of the system. A client that is commissioning things, that dialogue. And then within a project, you will have always a conceptual dialogue. You have a poetic dialogue, a cultural, historical, contextual. Not to forget the technical and technological, that is actually quite intrinsic to what we do. Environmental, fundamental these days, financial and legal, otherwise project will never happen either. And this dialogue happened, and these dialogues are happening in many different ways and means. So verbal dialogues, written dialogues, numeric, diagrammatic, graphic, audiovisual. So I wanted to go a little bit through the list because obviously we can extend more and more of that type of dialogues that we can actually enumerate. So this diagram here is showing the fact that from the top, from dialogues in design, the whole interaction between all the types of dialogues, parallel, and all the agreements and disagreements, they actually end up putting us in a position in which basically we start designing in dialogue. So instead of dialogues in design, it's really designing in dialogue with others, with other context, with other opportunities. The lecture today, really what it tries to do is to look at three completely different examples. Okay, on the left-hand side, we have a pavilion that was designed by myself, my practice, in collaboration with Atelier Buckler, Boomershue and Atelier Buckler, and it's an installation. It's a small pavilion. The one in the center is a building that I collaborate to design, and it's designed by Hedwig Studio. It's in Singapore. It's from 2013, and it's a university building. And the third one is a master plan or planning, like town planning exercise in California. So there are three completely different scales, three completely different architects, context that I believe could help us to actually talk about the role of dialogues and the forms of dialogues in architecture. So let's start with the unknown island. So this project I'm going to introduce to you is basically a very, very internal dialogue. And this is the story of three very energetic young designers that they decided to actually present a proposal for the Triennale of Lisbon for architecture 12, 13 years ago. It was a really intense dialogue, internal dialogue about like the three key components of the project. It was completely open. One was something that represents Portugal. You can see this image, a piece of history of Portugal, a famous one. Final location in Lisbon. And the third one was that should relate to the history of architecture. In this case, we decided that would be a retrospective of 100 years of architecture. So all these different components actually derive in a massive debate about what actually put together. And the answer to those, it was basically a book. And it's a book of a Nobel Prize writer, José Saramago, and it's the very short tale of the unknown island. In short, this tale, it was actually telling us that a person goes to the king and asks for the boat. And the king asks, like, what do you need a boat for? Well, I'm going to go to actually find the unknown island. And the king is answering, I will not give you a boat because all the islands that are in the map exist. And he said, no, in the map you have just those that exist. I'm looking for the unknown one. And that was actually very inspiring for us because that was actually a dialogue itself within a book that we can refer into something. That was one was about the history of Portugal in terms of discovery other territories, but also particularly about one thing, that is a very strong analogy to the fact that if you consider that everything exists, you don't have any need to actually invent anything else. So this is really talking about creativity. It's talking about like going beyond what you know. You don't actually be just like happy to what you know, but trying to actually go beyond that. We thought that that was very inspiring, and as such, what we did, and those were years in which we were extremely linked to the idea of narrative architecture. So these images I show you now here are basically the three of us designing this project to some extent and thinking about Portugal, that is what we have on the screen, and being this old cabinet inside probably a very old boat when we actually looking at cartography and maps and thinking about how it's been the history of the country and how actually it's been bottled and represented by a boat that has been going around, and then how the tale of the unknown island can really help us to find a location. The location was easy. It's the very center of Lisbon, it's the Plaza de Comercio, and the reality of that square is that in the middle of the square, there is the sculpture of the king. So it was a way to actually decide that, in essence, we were talking about an architectural device, artifact. It would be a boat. And that was basically the pavilion that we introduced. Now, obviously that boat, it should actually be part of a contemporary, interpretation of the city. This is the Plaza de Comercio, what is actually one of the most incredible examples of neoclassic architecture in Europe, actually the first one before the Haussmann Boulevards. And what happened here is that the big fire of the 18th century turned that into a new place. The concept of the boat evolved from this symbol of trade and tradition to the block, the very boring block that represents the contemporary architecture coming together to bring Portugal into modernity. And then these lines, vertical lines, that they represent 100 years of the architectural retrospective of Portuguese architecture to basically bring into this concept. So that was the idea of a boat, is basically different poles that they hold in different pixels of corn that they can actually represent this journey of creativity for Portugal. We consider this an extremely interesting exercise internally, but it was a point in which the dialogue between us had to be extended to the dialogue with the city of Lisbon. And the city of Lisbon was, and the Saramago Foundation, they were very excited about the project. But at the same time, it was a big challenge. And it was a big challenge because this is a very symbolic square. It has a lot of logistics behind. Some of the sponsorship was concerned about having that in that location because they will own the pavilion. So in short, the dialogues that will need to happen basically after the project, they end up actually continue in an endless, a different proposition of the pavilion, whether it's in Lisbon, whether it's in Venice, whether it's internalized in another location in Portugal, like this one on the screen. But the reality is that this dialogue end up being in the drawing board. And all these drawings, all these ideas, actually, this dialogue was a very internal conceptual dialogue. So the last project I would like to show you is more the type of work I'm doing lately. And this is about planning and master planning. And the first project was about the dialogue, a very internal dialogue of the team, right? Discussing of what should be the concept of the project. The second one was more dialogue between, once you have a concept, is the dialogue with the rest of the specialists and the professionals that they actually help to materialize that concept. This one is basically what I would call the total dialogue. That is when we actually try to do the most complex things, that is to regenerate, transform, or create new city. A new city actually need to actually take into account so many different elements, aspects, communities, initiatives, that it's basically where effectively, in my opinion, these dialogues in design turn into designing in dialogue with. Because it's absolutely impossible. You cannot design in isolation anything if the final result is something that is bringing together, it's bringing together architecture, functions, streets, landscape, regulation. There are so many aspects, so many different landowners, communities, existing communities, ecology, economics, prosperity. So there are so many different aspects that actually the role of the architect in this case is a mediator between all these dialogues and try to actually bring them together, because everyone actually should be to some extent content that is part of it. And that would be the goal, right? To create a great place. I'm going to show you an example of a particular example about the dialogues that and the challenges behind dialogues and challenges behind one project. So this is the Bay of San Francisco. We have the city of San Francisco up there, and then San Jose on the other corner. And in between is the famous Silicon Valley. Famous because back in the time, actually, it was a place for NASA. It was a place for the defense industry of the United States. And lately, it's been the last 20 years, been actually home for Facebook, Google, Microsoft. and many others. The reality is that it's extremely fruitful as a place for innovation and inventions, but it's not a nice place to live in. It's a place that is full of parkings, cars, offices. That's why there are small spots there like Palo Alto and others that might actually be like pleasant, but in general terms, it's not really a nice place to live. And one of the key things is that it's coming more and more, and that is not just specific to Silicon Valley, it's just happening throughout many other industrialized areas in Europe and in many other in the United States and also in Asia, is the idea of the ecological innovation district, the eco-innovation district. So this in essence started to some extent in Boston University, but now it's extended in sector in many other places. And it's basically a concept by which you take a place that has actually a good economic activity and relates to the university, so that research and manufacturing to some extent, they can come together. And then what you do is like on top of that, be sure that it's a place that is not just working in isolation. That effectively means that you are bringing residents. The moment that you bring in residents to a place, the whole picture of a place changes, because that means that you need the schools, you need hospitals, you need parks, you need basically the full equipment of what we consider is a nice place to live. While when you have just offices, ideally we have amazing offices. And in many cases, all we have are boxes, windows, and parkings. That is changing, transforming into this idea of building in some industrial districts, the idea of the eco-innovation district. Very, very, very key principles of it are common to many of them. I'll show you a few examples of, for instance, the Hammarby district in Stockholm. There's a good example in Sweden, or the Mind Milan Expo Innovation District now, that's actually under construction, or even the Olympic Park, that to some extent in London was an opportunity. The Olympics were a fundamental thing, but at the same time an excuse to extend the city to the east of London and bring a lot of like innovation industry and universities and housing to the area. So I will actually go more precisely to talk about some dialogues within this, the importance of those. Let's say that one of these cities in Silicon Valley, they are aiming to basically improve their industrial parks and be sure that actually they bring in this idea of the eco-innovation district. Okay, that's great. You know, they are actually convinced that it's a good thing to do. Let's say that people who own the land as well is convinced that it's a good thing to do, and this is an agreement. That is a great dialogue. Okay, it took years to have this agreement. So at some point in this particular example I'm showing you in the city of Sunnyvale, they decided that they need a new planning tool to actually consider the fact that you want to bring residents and you want to actually change the future of the area. So Sunnyvale is that in that red dot that I added in the map. Is basically, this map is in between Santa Clara and Mountain View. It's just, you can see Palo Alto and Stanford University there on the west side. Within that, in the red spot, we have Muffet Park. It's a business park with different actors and different owners. Effectively, is basically a accumulation of offices and parkings. So this is basically how it looks today, and just show you from an urban perspective, these buildings that you see there are extremely massive. They are like 200 meters long. Okay, they're massive office buildings. But you are not able to create a community of people where people want to live in a place of these characteristics. So now I'm going to swap to the next one, which you're going to see. This is the normal size of a mid-rise building. Okay, so if I go back and see, you'll see that in the same amount of space, you can actually pack many more buildings and parks and elements that they can create a place. So this is what we call the urban granularity, from a really extensive one use, that is the blue represented by office here, to start actually adding residential, adding like open space and parks to create this eco-innovation district. So for now, let's say that the dialogue continues. Those promoting this, particularly the city and the authorities, they're happy with the direction of trying to change the plans to allow this transformation, but there are a lot of challenges. So I will show you a few of them. So that's easier to see in an example like that. Like if we zoom in a little bit more, this is the existing with these office buildings. This is the proposed. As you can see that there are many more elements. The red dots that start indicating areas of public realm, like plazas, main streets, okay, that they didn't exist before. That's absolutely helpful now to see the way in which we start distributing different uses from the main square in the center to the main avenue that is connecting here north, south, the different functions of this neighborhood. And it's a point in which we go to the streets. And I'm going to stop here for a second. So let's say we have like high technology companies, in this area, and have enough money to transform the place. And the city wants to change it, and they want to change it. Well, imagine this debate. We want a place where people don't need to use the car. We're talking about a place where people need to drive for 2 hours every day to go here to work for Facebook. Okay? We are proposing in a meeting for a long time that is a place that is pedestrian. And everyone is saying yes, but it's a point in which suddenly someone will say, well, like the street without cars. We cannot have shops. Why? Because people will not see the shops. No one would be able to buy in the shops if it's not a car passing by. We don't have in our code, it's impossible. A street cannot be understood without having an area for a vehicle. So if you think about it, basically the dialogue that is required to actually go through all the different steps from basically all the way from convincing people that it's possible to have a pedestrian street, in our case in Europe is quite normal, to an area that everything starting from the code was designed and the legislation was designed to be sure that the cars are basically able to reach every single corner. It was a really, really interesting debate to the extent that things like, for instance, I think in this project there is one only street that is fully pedestrian. There are some streets that they can have cars and people. There is one. And that was actually a really, really long debate. And to some extent, in our opinion, it was a bit of an act of revolution that they allowed to have one that is just pedestrian. Okay? So that is talking about the level of complexity and the type of tone and forms of dialogues that they need to be established, to actually progressively being able to achieve things and create the consensus to be able to transform things. So it goes to the idea of not actually taking things for granted that I was talking about when we were showing the boat and the tale of Saramago, and how actually the dialogues are actually able, the right dialogues are able to unlock all these different situations to actually create successful architectural propositions and transformations of the city. So effectively, is in this case, the architect, the master planner could be this mediator between the community. In this case, it was a huge amount of information and exchange with the community, the tone of the community, the tone basically of the dialogue with the community is a very important one. The developers that obviously, they need to actually as well make an investment that brings some revenue to some extent, the authorities that in many cases they really want things to change, but there is a lot of small impediments and barriers that they need to go through. And all of us, the urban designers, the architects, the landscape architects, the planners, that they need to bring together and talk to each other to be sure that we're actually defending one common ground for every piece. So I think that was a little bit my contribution today to the dialogues. I think it was a bit shorter than you probably expected, but I'm gonna keep it there and just please go ahead and go